The wind howled like a wounded animal as James Hartwell bolted his farmhouse door against the winter storm of 1945. He never imagined that one act of mercy on that frozen February night would put him at the center of a military tribunal, facing a firing squad or force an entire U.S. Army unit to question everything they believed about enemy and ally. But that's exactly what happened when he heard that desperate knock on his barn door. James Hartwell had lived alone on his Pennsylvania farm since Martha died 3 years earlier. The war felt distant here, something that happened in newspapers and radio broadcasts, not in the quiet fields where he'd spent 53 years of his life. But the war had a way of finding everyone eventually. That night it came to his door in the form of a figure collapsed in the snow, wearing the unmistakable gray uniform of a German prisoner. The storm had begun at dusk, one of those brutal northeastern tempests that could bury a man in minutes. James had secured his livestock and was heading back to the house when he heard it, a sound barely audible over the wind. A human voice, weak and desperate. He grabbed his lantern and pushed through the knee-deep snow toward his barn. That's when he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 25, her face pale as death itself, lips blue from cold. The German military insignia on her torn uniform marked her as medical personnel. Blood had frozen on her temple where she'd been struck by something. Her hands, even through the cold, trembled as she tried to form words in broken English. Please. No hurt. Just cold. Please. Every instinct James had developed over 5 decades told him to be cautious. This was the enemy. German. The same nation that had plunged the world into chaos, that had killed thousands of American boys, including his own nephew Robert, who'd died at Normandy. But looking at this woman, this human being on the verge of freezing to death, James saw something else. He saw what Martha would have wanted him to see. Another soul in desperate need. He made his decision in seconds. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching through the storm, he helped her into the barn. The structure was old but solid, and with the animals inside it held some warmth. He cleared space in the hayloft, brought her 2 heavy wool blankets, and a canteen of water. She was shivering so violently she could barely hold it. "What's your name?" James asked quietly. The woman looked at him with eyes that held more fear than he'd ever seen. "Elise," she whispered. "Elise Zimmerman. Nurse. Was nurse." James nodded slowly. "You escaped from a transport convoy." She nodded, tears forming. "Storm. Truck crashed. I ran. They shoot others who ran. I just ran." James felt something twist in his chest. He'd read about the POW convoys that moved through the region, transporting captured Germans to detention camps further inland. In this storm, a crash would have been catastrophic. "Stay here tonight," he told her. "Storm's too dangerous. Dawn comes, you'll have to go." She nodded gratefully, understanding the enormous risk he was taking. As James turned to leave, Elise spoke again. "Why you help? I am enemy." James paused at the barn door, his weathered hand on the wooden frame. "Because my wife Martha used to say that the moment we stop seeing human beings as human beings is the moment we lose our own humanity. War doesn't change that. It just tests it." He left her there and returned to his farmhouse, but sleep wouldn't come. James sat by his fireplace, staring at the flames, thinking about choices and consequences. He thought about Robert, his sister's boy, barely 19 when he died on that beach in France. He thought about Martha, who'd volunteered at the church helping refugees, who'd believed in kindness even when the world seemed determined to prove her wrong. And he thought about the woman in his barn, enemy soldier or not, who'd looked at him with the same desperate hope he'd seen in wounded animals he'd nursed back to health over the years. What James didn't know was that 3 miles away, Captain William Foster was leading a 20-man unit through that same storm, tracking the exact prisoner who now slept in Hartwell's barn. Captain Foster was a career military man, 38 years old, who'd seen action from North Africa to the Rhine. He'd learned to follow orders without question, to see the enemy as the enemy, nothing more and nothing less. When the POW transport convoy crashed during the storm, killing 4 guards and allowing 6 prisoners to escape, Foster's orders were crystal clear. Find them. Bring them back. Use lethal force if necessary. 5 of the 6 had been recovered within hours, 3 dead from the cold, 2 recaptured trying to steal a car, but 1 remained missing. A female prisoner named Elise Zimmerman, former Wehrmacht nurse, captured 3 weeks earlier during the Allied push into Germany. Intelligence reports suggested she might have information about German medical experiments, making her recovery a priority. Foster's unit had tracked her footprints through the snow until the storm intensified and covered all traces. They'd taken shelter in an abandoned church waiting for dawn. Sergeant Thomas Riley, Foster's second-in-command, was adamant about continuing the search immediately. She could be anywhere, Captain. Could reach sympathizers. Could compromise intelligence. Foster shook his head. In this storm, Riley, she's either dead already or holed up somewhere waiting it out. We search at first light. We'll cover every farm, every structure within a 5-mile radius. Private Eddie Chen, the youngest member of the unit at just 20 years old, sat quietly cleaning his rifle. He'd been in Europe for only 2 months and still struggled with the realities of war. The idea of hunting down a woman, even an enemy combatant, troubled him. But he kept his thoughts to himself, knowing that doubt was dangerous in a unit that operated on absolute trust and obedience. As dawn approached, the storm finally began to break. James hadn't slept at all. He'd checked on Elise twice during the night, bringing her hot soup he'd made and an old coat that had belonged to Martha. Each time she'd thanked him with tears in her eyes, unable to comprehend why this American farmer was risking everything for her. On his final check, just as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, Elise told him her story. She spoke in halting English, pieced together with gestures and drawings in the dust on the barn floor. She'd been a nurse in Berlin, working in civilian hospitals until she was conscripted into military service in 1943. She hadn't wanted to serve the Wehrmacht, but refusal meant imprisonment or worse for her and her family. She'd been assigned to a field hospital near the front lines, treating wounded German soldiers but also, in secret, helping Allied prisoners who were brought in with critical injuries. That's why she'd been transferred to a POW convoy. Someone had reported her compassion toward enemy wounded. She was being sent back to Germany to face charges of treason. The crash during the storm had been her only chance at freedom, or at least at choosing her own fate rather than facing a firing squad in Berlin. James listened to her story and felt the weight of it. This woman had made the same choice he was making now. Humanity over orders, compassion over compliance, and she'd paid a terrible price for it. You understand they're looking for you, James said quietly. Elise nodded. I know. I bring danger to you. I should go. James shook his head. Storm's breaking, but it's still dangerous. Give it another hour. There's a Quaker community 15 miles north. They help people. All people. I'll give you directions. She looked at him with something approaching hope. Why you do this? You not know me? James smiled sadly. Because if we only help the people we know, the people who look like us or talk like us or fight for the same flag as us, then we're not really help at all. We're just picking sides. Martha taught me that, but that hour would never come. As the dawn light strengthened, James looked out through a gap in the barn boards and felt his blood turn to ice. Soldiers, at least 20 of them, forming a perimeter around his property. He recognized the U.S. Army uniforms immediately. They'd found her, or found him, or both. Captain Foster had begun the dawn search with military precision. His unit spread out in a grid pattern, checking every structure. When they approached the Hartwell farm, Riley noticed smoke from the chimney and fresh tracks in the snow leading to the barn. Tracks made within the last few hours. He signaled to Foster. The captain raised his hand, and the entire unit froze. He studied the farm carefully. It looked innocent enough. A typical rural property, weathered but well-maintained. But something felt off. Those tracks, too fresh, too deliberate. He made quick hand signals, and his men understood immediately. Surround the property. Silent approach. Weapons ready. Inside the barn, James made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Elise, he whispered urgently. Soldiers outside, U.S. Army. They're surrounding the farm. Elise went pale, her hands shaking. I am sorry. I am so sorry I bring this to you. James gripped her shoulder. Listen to me. When they come in, you tell them I forced you. Tell them I was holding you captive. That I captured you for information or because I'm sympathetic to Germany. Whatever story keeps you alive. She shook her head violently. No, I will not lie. You saved my life. I will not destroy yours. Their argument was cut short by a voice outside, amplified and commanding. This is Captain William Foster of the United States Army. We have the structure surrounded. Anyone inside has 30 seconds to exit with hands visible and raised. Comply immediately, or we will enter by force." James looked at Elise one last time. Then he pushed open the barn door and walked out into the dawn light, hands raised high above his head. The sight that greeted him was overwhelming. Rifles pointed at him from every direction, soldiers crouched behind cover, a captain standing front and center with his sidearm drawn. "James Hartwell," he called out, his voice steady. "Are you James Hartwell, owner of this property?" James nodded. "I am. And before you ask, yes, she's in the barn. She's unarmed. She's injured, and she's under my protection." The words hung in the cold morning air like a challenge. Riley started forward, but Foster held up a hand to stop him. "Your protection, Hartwell? Do you understand you're harboring an enemy combatant? A prisoner of war who escaped lawful custody?" James kept his hands raised, but his voice was firm. "I understand I gave shelter to a human being who was freezing to death in a storm. Your uniform and her uniform don't change that basic fact, Captain." Foster's jaw tightened. "Sergeant Riley, secure the barn. Bring out the prisoner." Riley and 3 other soldiers moved quickly, entering the barn with weapons raised. Moments later they emerged with Elise, her hands now bound with rope, her face showing resignation but also something else. A quiet dignity. She looked at James and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Foster approached James directly, holstering his sidearm. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm placing you under military custody for aiding and abetting an enemy combatant. You'll be transported to Regional Command for questioning and probable court-martial. Do you understand the charges?" James nodded slowly. "I understand them, Captain. I don't agree with them, but I understand them." What Foster did next surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of immediately ordering James to be restrained and transported, he paused. He studied this farmer, this civilian who'd just thrown away his freedom for a principle. "Why, Hartwell?" The captain's voice carried genuine confusion. "Why would you risk everything for her? She's German. She's the enemy. We're at war." James lowered his hands slowly, and when no one shot him, he kept them at his sides. "Captain, my nephew Robert died at Normandy. My cousin Frank lost both legs in the Ardennes. I've got more reasons to hate Germans than most folks in this county. But that woman in your custody, she didn't pull a trigger on Robert. She didn't plant the mine that took Frank's legs. She's a nurse who was conscripted into service, and from what she told me, she was being sent back to face execution for the crime of treating wounded prisoners with basic human decency. So when I found her dying in the snow during a storm that would have killed her in another hour, I made a choice. The same choice my wife would have made. The same choice I hope someone would make for Robert or Frank if they'd been the ones freezing to death in enemy territory." The silence that followed was profound. Private Chen, standing at the perimeter, lowered his rifle slightly. Even Riley, hardened by years of combat, seemed to hesitate. But it was Foster who spoke, and his voice carried the weight of command and something else. "Conflict. That's a moving speech, Hartwell. But it doesn't change the law. It doesn't change orders. You harbored an escaped prisoner. She could have intelligence vital to the war effort. Your compassion, however noble you think it was, could have cost American lives." James met the captain's eyes steadily. "Could have. Might have. Maybe. Those are all future worries, Captain, but her dying in that storm, that was a present reality. I dealt with what was in front of me. Let history judge whether I was right or wrong." Foster turned to Riley. "Secure them both in separate transport vehicles." We returned to base immediately. As soldiers moved to comply, Private Chen stepped forward, his young face troubled. "Captain, permission to speak?" Foster glanced at him, irritated. "Make it quick, Private." Chen swallowed hard but continued. "Sir, my grandfather came to America from China with nothing. He was treated like dirt, called a foreigner, denied work, denied basic rights. But one American family gave him shelter when he needed it, risked their reputation in a town that hated Chinese immigrants. That family's kindness is the only reason I exist, sir. The only reason I'm here wearing this uniform. I'm just saying, sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same thing." The words landed like artillery shells in the quiet dawn. Riley's face reddened. "Private, you're out of line. Stand down." But Foster held up a hand. "No, Sergeant. Let him speak. He's earned that right." Chen looked grateful but continued carefully. I'm not saying we don't follow orders, sir. I'm just asking, what orders are we really following? Orders to capture an escaped prisoner, yes. But also, aren't we fighting this war because we believe in human dignity? Because we believe people shouldn't be punished for showing mercy? If we court-martial this man for the same values we claim to be fighting for, what does that make us? Foster felt something crack inside him. He'd spent years building walls around his conscience, telling himself that following orders was enough, that the moral complications could be sorted out after the war. But standing here in this frozen Pennsylvania dawn, looking at an old farmer who'd risked everything for a principle, and a young private who still believed wars were fought for ideals and not just territory, those walls began to crumble. "Mr. Hartwell," Foster said slowly, "tell me exactly what happened last night. Every detail." James did, leaving nothing out. The knock on the barn door, the decision to provide shelter, the blankets, the soup, the conversation, Elise's story about being a nurse who'd helped enemy wounded and was facing execution for it. Everything. When James finished, Foster turned to Elise, who stood between two guards. "Is his account accurate? Do you confirm you were being transported for treason charges because you provided medical care to Allied prisoners?" Elise nodded, her English halting but clear. "Yes. I am nurse. Hippocratic oath say help all who suffer. I help German soldiers. I help American soldiers. I help British soldiers. All the same to me. All suffering. All human. Wehrmacht say I am traitor. Say I give comfort to enemy. They right. I did give comfort. Because that is what nurse does." Foster closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, every man in his unit could see the captain was making a decision that would define his career, and possibly end it. "Sergeant Riley, unbind the prisoner." Riley's eyes widened. "Sir?" Foster's voice hardened. "I gave an order, Sergeant." Riley hesitated for only a moment before complying. Elise stood free, confused and afraid. Foster addressed his entire unit. "Gentlemen, we came here to recover an escaped prisoner. What we found instead is significantly more complicated. We found a medical professional who was being transported to face execution for the crime of treating wounded soldiers regardless of their nationality. We found an American civilian who provided emergency humanitarian aid during a life-threatening storm. These are not the clear-cut circumstances we were briefed to expect." "Captain," Riley interjected, with respect, "she's still an escaped German POW. He's still a civilian who harbored her." "The law is clear." Foster nodded. "The law is clear, Sergeant, you're absolutely right, but we're not lawyers, we're soldiers. And we need to ask ourselves what we're actually accomplishing here. If we arrest Hartwell, we're telling every American civilian that showing mercy to a dying person is a crime. If we return Zimmerman to German custody, we're complicit in executing someone whose only crime was upholding a medical oath that predates any nation or flag. Is that really what we signed up for?" The unit stirred uncomfortably. Some nodded. Others looked conflicted. Riley remained rigid. "Captain Foster, I must formally object. This sets a dangerous precedent." Foster met his sergeant's eyes. "Noted and logged, Sergeant. But my decision stands." He turned back to James and Elise. "Mr. Hartwell, you're free to go. No charges will be filed. Miss Zimmerman, you'll be transported to Regional Command, but I'll personally ensure you're processed as a medical POW under Geneva Convention protections, not as a criminal facing German military justice. I'll recommend you be assigned to a U.S. military hospital where your nursing skills can be utilized for the duration of the war." Elise's eyes filled with tears. "I will not be sent back to Germany." Foster shook his head. "Not if I have anything to say about it. And I outrank anyone within 200 miles who might disagree." James stepped forward. "Captain, I appreciate what you're doing. But won't this cause problems for you?" Foster smiled grimly. "Almost certainly. I'll probably face a review board. Might lose my command. Might even face charges myself. But I've been thinking a lot lately about what kind of man I want to be when this war ends. When I go home and people ask me what I did, what I stood for, I think I'd rather face a review board than face myself in the mirror knowing I executed someone for being compassionate." Private Chen stepped forward again. "Captain, for the record, I support your decision. If there's any fallout, I'll testify to everything I witnessed here." Several other soldiers murmured agreement. Even Riley, after a long moment, nodded slowly. I still think you're making a mistake, Captain, but I respect the principle behind it. I'll stand with the unit. Foster felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. All right then. Riley, organize transport for Miss Zimmerman. Comfortable transport, Sergeant. She's not a criminal. She's a medical professional in our custody. Chen, you'll accompany her and ensure she's treated with dignity. The rest of you, this mission is classified. What happened here stays here until I've had a chance to file my report through proper channels. Everyone clear? Sir, yes, sir. The unit responded in unison. As soldiers began breaking down the perimeter, James approached Elise one final time. She gripped his weathered hands in her own. You saved my life. I never forget. Never. James smiled. You just stay alive, Elise. Stay alive, and when this war is over, you help people. That's all the thanks I need. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I promise. I promise I help people. All people. Like you do. Captain Foster watched the exchange and felt something shift in his understanding of the war. He'd spent years seeing it in black and white. Us versus them. Allied versus Axis. But standing here in this Pennsylvania dawn, watching an American farmer and a German nurse say goodbye with genuine affection and respect, he realized the truth was infinitely more complex. Wars were fought between nations and ideologies, but they were experienced by individuals. And individuals, he was learning, had a remarkable capacity for transcending the conflicts their governments created. As the military convoy prepared to leave, Foster approached James one last time. Mr. Hartwell, I want you to know that what you did last night took more courage than most of the combat actions I've seen in this war. You risked everything for a principle, for a person you didn't know who by all conventional definitions was your enemy. That's the kind of moral courage we're supposed to be fighting for. James shook the captain's hand. You made a courageous choice too, Captain. You're risking your career, maybe your freedom. That's not easy. Foster smiled. Yeah, well, I had a good example to follow. The convoy departed as the morning sun finally broke through the storm clouds. James stood alone in his farmyard, watching them disappear down the snowy road. He thought about Martha, about what she would have said about the night's events. She would have been proud. She would have done exactly the same thing. He also thought about the consequences that might still come. Foster had spared him military charges, but civilian authorities might not be so understanding. Neighbors might turn against him. He might lose everything anyway. But standing there in the clean morning light, James Hartwell felt something he hadn't felt since Martha died. Peace. He'd made a choice that honored everything she'd taught him, everything he believed about human dignity and compassion. Whatever consequences came, he could face them knowing he'd been true to himself and true to the values that made life worth living. What James couldn't know that morning was how far the ripples of his actions would spread. Captain Foster did indeed face a review board 3 weeks later. He was questioned extensively about his decision to release James and to protect Elise from extradition. The board was split. Some members viewed his actions as dangerously insubordinate. Others saw them as exemplifying the very values America claimed to fight for. In the end, Foster received an official reprimand but retained his command. More importantly, his report about Elise Zimmerman's circumstances prompted a broader review of how medical personnel POWs were being processed. Elise herself was assigned to a U.S. military hospital in Maryland, where she worked for the remainder of the war. Her skills as a nurse were exceptional, and she earned the respect and friendship of American medical staff and patients alike. When the war ended in May 1945, she faced a choice: return to a devastated Germany or try to build a new life in America. With Captain Foster's help and testimony, she was granted refugee status and eventually citizenship. She spent the rest of her life working as a nurse in Philadelphia, known for her unwavering compassion for all patients regardless of background. James Hartwell did face some local backlash. Some neighbors stopped speaking to him. Some called him a traitor. But he also received letters from across the country, from people who'd heard his story and were inspired by it. Gold Star mothers who'd lost sons in the war wrote to thank him for proving that compassion could survive even in wartime. Veterans wrote to say that his actions reminded them what they were actually fighting for. The negative voices faded over time, but the positive impact of his choice echoed for years. Private Eddie Chen continued to serve with distinction, and after the war became a teacher. He told his students the story of that winter morning every year, using it as an example of moral courage and the importance of questioning authority when orders conflict with fundamental human values. Generations of students carried that lesson forward. Captain William Foster remained in the military for another decade. He never forgot that dawn in Pennsylvania. It became his touchstone, his reminder that following orders wasn't enough. A soldier, a human being, had to be willing to make hard choices based on principles even when those choices came with serious risks. He taught that lesson to every young officer who served under him. And Sergeant Thomas Riley, who'd been so adamant about following protocol that morning, had his own evolution. Years later, he admitted to Foster that watching the captain make that difficult choice had changed him. It had shown him that true leadership sometimes meant standing alone for what was right, even when regulations and orders pointed in a different direction. The story of that winter storm became something of a legend in the region. Different versions circulated, some exaggerated, some simplified, but the core remained true. An American farmer had chosen humanity over hatred. A German nurse had upheld her oath even when it meant risking her life. A U.S. Army captain had prioritized justice over blind obedience. And a group of soldiers had witnessed proof that even in the darkest hours of war, compassion and moral courage could survive. The barn where Elise had sheltered still stands on the Hartwell property today. James lived there until his death in 1968, never regretting his choice. In his final days, he received a letter from Elise, now known as Elise Zimmerman Foster. Having married Captain Foster 3 years after the war ended, she wrote about the life they'd built together, about the children they were raising to value compassion and human dignity above all else. She wrote about patients she'd cared for and lives she'd saved. And she thanked James one final time for being the man who proved to her that humanity could transcend hatred, that individual choice mattered even when the world seemed consumed by conflict. James died with that letter on his bedside table, at peace with a life that had been defined by one crucial choice on one frozen February night. A choice that proved sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons on distant battlefields, but with moral courage in our own hearts when we're faced with another human being in desperate need. The war ended 75 years ago, but the questions James Hartwell faced that night remain urgent and relevant. When do we choose compassion over compliance? When do we recognize our common humanity, even with those designated as enemies? How do we maintain our moral core when the world demands we surrender it? These aren't historical questions. They're human questions that every generation must answer. James Hartwell answered them in a barn during a winter storm, with actions that spoke louder than any words. His answer echoed through decades, touching lives, changing perspectives, reminding us all that we always have a choice. And sometimes the right choice is the hardest one. Sometimes the right choice means standing alone. But it's still the right choice. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button to hear more untold stories from history that challenge how we think about courage, humanity, and the choices that define us. Drop a like if you believe compassion matters even in the darkest times, and leave a comment telling us about a time you or someone you know chose humanity over hatred. These stories matter. Your voice matters. Let's keep this conversation going.